He swore off touch for 15 years, then a bride arrived by mistake. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Utah Territory, early spring. The mountains still wore snow like shawls draped across their ridgelines in jagged whites. Down in the valley, the air held that knife-sharp edge that promised thaw but cut like winter. On his isolated ranch, Caleb Rourke split logs in a steady rhythm, each swing of the axe another punctuation mark in 15 years of silence. He liked it that way. Chores filled the days, the stove filled the nights, and no one asked him for more than he was willing to give. He'd been a man who once laughed easily, who once touched freely. Then a black-edged letter in a train station took his wife from him with a single line about a field hospital shell. From that day forward, he let his hands do only work, never comfort, never affection. Solitude became his oath. He hadn't touched a woman since. That oath cracked the moment a figure appeared on the muddy road, dragging a battered suitcase. She was young, maybe mid-20s, bonnet bent against the wind skirt, hem soaked with clay. One boot heel was broken, so she half-limped the last stretch. She stopped at his fence line, steadying herself with a glove against the post. "Mr. Rourke," she asked. Her voice was papery from wind and dust. Caleb straightened, resting the axe against the chopping block. He nodded once. "My name's Lila Hart." Her eyes didn't waver. "I believe I'm your mail-order bride." The words hit like a stone dropped in a frozen creek. No splash, just a hard thud that kept echoing. Caleb frowned. "My what?" She pulled an envelope from her coat. The paper was thin-creased from too many foldings. "From Matrimonial Matches in Omaha. Addressed to you, signed with your name." Caleb took it cautiously, studied the ink. His name was there, but the hand wasn't his. "This isn't mine," I figured. Lila's tone carried no surprise, only the weary finality of someone who'd spent her last coin on hope. But it was enough to get me here. The wind whipped harder. Her coat was far too thin, her cheeks raw. She added quietly, "I left everything. Job, room, what little I owned. There's no one waiting back east, and it seems no one here either." She turned slow and resigned, like someone who had been told no more times than yes. "Wait," Caleb said. The word came out rough, like it hadn't been used in years. She stopped, wary. He gestured toward the cabin. "Storm'll roll in by night. You'll sleep inside." "Inside? I'll take the chair. You near the stove. One night." Her jaw tightened, but finally she nodded. He unlatched the gate. She passed through, carefully keeping her distance, and they walked together to the cabin without another word. Inside smelled of pine smoke and black coffee. A narrow bed, a table scarred by hot pans, a stove with iron belly glowing. Lila placed her suitcase in the corner, unknotted her bonnet, and scanned the room like memorizing exits. Then she swept the porch without being asked. By dusk, she had fed the hens, fetched water, and put a pot of beans and salt pork on the stove. Caleb stayed outside until the kettle hissed. When she set a bowl for him, he waited for her to leave, then ate in silence. By the time she returned with another bucket of water, the bowl was empty, cleaned, and back on the shelf. No thanks spoken, none expected. So their days began. Lila worked without question, patching curtains, oiling a squeaky hinge, finding ways to make the place less tired. She mended his shirt's elbow with a needle and thread that appeared from her suitcase. She moved with a quiet efficiency that reminded him of water carving a new bed for itself. Caleb noticed details he tried to ignore: her cough at night, the way the broken boot rubbed her heel raw, the humming she did when she forgot to stop herself. He left his spare coat on the door peg before a cold rain, and when her cough worsened, he set out a dented tin of peppermint tea beside her cup, always silently as if chores had done it. Lila noticed too, not his kindness, but his absence. He never stood close enough for shoulders to brush. He angled himself away so she could pass without touching. He left tools where she wouldn't have to reach near him. He wasn't cruel. He was careful in a way that felt like grief barricaded. One evening, after hours of mending the chicken coop, Lila sat on the porch, boots heavy with mud. Caleb brushed down the mare at the hitching post. She called softly over the wind, "Do you always treat your guests like ghosts, Mr. Rourke?" He froze. "You're not a guest." The word stung sharper than he meant. She folded her arms, then a mistake. Silence stretched. Finally she asked, "If I wasn't meant to be here, why haven't you sent me away?" He turned halfway, meeting her gaze longer than he had before. Something inside him shifted, fragile as spring thaw beneath frost. He didn't answer. She didn't press. Lila went back inside and shut the door gently. Caleb stayed outside the brush, moving again over the mare's flank, but his chest felt different, unsteady. That night the cabin's silence wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting like a room where one more piece of furniture was about to arrive, or a page expecting its first sentence. Caleb sat at the table with supper gone cold, and knew the life he thought was carved in stone had just shifted. The storm that had threatened finally broke 2 nights later. Rain hammered the valley, rattling against the cabin windows until the seams leaked tiny rivers down the log walls. Caleb Rourke worked the stove harder than usual, keeping flames alive with pine he split before dawn. Lila Hart had gone to the creek earlier to wash linens and returned, pale water dripping from her skirts, her breathing sharp. She said nothing, just wrung fabric dry and spread it near the fire. By evening, Caleb noticed her absence from the kitchen's usual rhythm. No kettle hissing, no spoon against the pot. He found her curled on the narrow bed hair, damp against her temple skin, hot beneath a sheen of sweat. The basin of water she'd fetched sat untouched. "Miss Hart," his voice rasped from lack of use. She didn't stir. Caleb set a hand against her forehead before his instincts caught up. Heat scorched his palm. He froze. 15 years since he'd touched another soul willingly, but he didn't pull back. Not this time. He fetched another cloth, dampened it, pressed it against her brow. She whimpered in her fever, twisting at the sheets, mumbling words that made his chest tighten. "No. Don't. Please. Stop." Her voice cracked with remembered fear. "You're safe," he said low, steady as if saying it could build walls around her. "No one here will touch you. You're safe, Lila." Her breathing slowed. He stayed through the night, trading cloths, checking her pulse. Whispering reassurance meant as much for him as for her. Every hour felt like a test whether he could stay present without letting old grief drag him back under. He didn't sleep, not a blink. The weight of her hand in his work-worn, calloused alive tethered him to a place he'd thought he'd lost forever. By dawn, the fever broke. Lila stirred, eyes unfocused, but aware enough to notice him slumped beside her. His hand slipped away too late. She'd felt it. "You stayed," she whispered. Caleb cleared his throat, awkward. It isn't safe to sleep through a fever. You needed water. Silence fell heavy, though not cold. Lila studied him, then let out a breath that seemed to carry years. I thought I was going to die. You'll be all right, he said, though certainty didn't come easy to him. She lay quiet a moment longer before speaking again, voice hushed but steady. Before this, I worked at an inn, roadside place. After my parents died, they called it an apprenticeship. It was labor, nothing more. When the owner drank, her voice trailed. She didn't finish. She didn't have to. One night I hid in a cart, rode it west. Thought a matchmaker's letter might mean a new start. Caleb bowed his head. The image of her fleeing hands that never asked permission pressed sharp against his mind. You never told me, he said. You never asked. The words cut, though not unfairly. Caleb sat back, staring at the floorboards. His voice came quieter than he intended. My wife was a nurse. She died in the war. Lila turned her head on the pillow, watching him. I wondered. You walk like a man left behind. The remark struck him harder than any accusation. He saw again the crowded station, where the letter found him, the black seal, breaking like bone beneath his fingers. He remembered the last thing his wife had said before boarding that train. You always think you'll get to say goodbye, but you don't. He hadn't let himself hold anyone since. Touch had become dangerous, a trigger for grief. Now here was a woman he hadn't asked for, burning with fever, forcing his hand to break the vow he thought kept him safe. They didn't weep. They didn't fall into one another's arms. But something unspoken passed between them that morning. Recognition. A language broken people understood when they saw the same shape of pain mirrored in another. Lila rested, and Caleb stayed at the hearth, watching embers glow to ash. His hand still remembered hers. And for the first time in 15 years, he didn't feel cursed for surviving. He just felt human again. When Lila regained strength, life on the ranch resumed in cautious steps. She rose early, tended hens, boiled water. Caleb mended fences, chopped wood, pretended the days hadn't changed. Yet everything had. They began to share space differently, passing a dish without avoiding each other's fingers, speaking a few words where silence once ruled. One evening, after a long day hammering boards into the chicken coop, Lila sat on the porch, boots muddy, hands raw. Caleb brushed down the mare, back turned until she spoke softly. Do you believe mistakes can turn into something worth keeping? He stopped brushing but didn't turn. Depends on the mistake. She looked at him, exhaustion softening her face, but not her resolve. Then maybe I'll stay long enough to find out. Caleb had no answer. He only nodded, but it was the first nod that felt less like a dismissal and more like a beginning. The storm passed, leaving the ground thick with mud and the air sharp with pine. Caleb Rourke saddled his bay mare one morning and rode the 2 days into Millwater, the nearest town. He went rarely, only when salt or nails or coffee ran out. He kept his head down, hat brim low, because solitude made a man conspicuous in a place where gossip bred faster than chickens in spring. Inside the general store, shopkeeper Clara Denby looked up from her ledger. Her eyes lingered a beat too long. Mr. Rourke, she said, tone light but sharpened. Heard there's news from your direction. Caleb froze, sack of flour in hand. What news? Clara leaned over the counter as though confiding, though her voice carried. Word is you sent for a bride. A young woman came in on the coach weeks back. Folks say she's at your place. The store went quiet. Men near the barrels of nails exchanged smirks. Caleb paid his bill without reply and walked out, the whispers trailing him like dust. Outside, the wind tugged at his coat and reminded him of the thinness of his patience. He didn't ride home. Instead, he turned north over ridges where pine thinned and rock showed through. The trail led to Mason Pike's spread, a neighbor and old friend who'd tried for years to drag Caleb back into town life. Mason was skinning a deer by his shed when Caleb dismounted, blood on his hands, a knife flashing in the sun. "Well now," Mason said, half grinning, "the ghost of Rourke come down for company." Caleb didn't waste time. "You sent the letter." Mason straightened, knife-stilled letter. "The one to Omaha. Matrimonial matches. My name, my ranch, sign like me." Mason spat in the dirt. "You think I meant harm. You've lived like a shadow since she died. 15 years of silence. I thought maybe." He gestured, helpless. "Maybe somebody new would bring you back." "You had no right," Caleb said. His voice was low but tight as a wire. "I had every damn right," Mason shot back. "I watched you rot in that cabin. Thought if a woman showed up, you'd remember you were still a man." Caleb's jaw worked. He turned, mounted, and rode away without another word. But Mason's parting shout carried, "She's not a curse, Rourke. Don't treat her like one." By the time Caleb reached home, dusk bruised the sky. The cabin windows glowed, faint smoke curling from the chimney. He stood a long while at the fence, listening to the crackle of fire within before stepping inside. Lila sat on the floor near the hearth, a basket of mending in her lap. The shirt she held was his, torn at the shoulder seam. She looked up, then back down, voice soft. "It tore here. Thought you'd want it patched before the cold turned sharper." Caleb stayed at the threshold, fists tight, Mason's words echoing. Lila's gaze flicked towards him, then back to the needle. "I didn't ask to be here," she whispered, "but since I am, might as well do something useful." He closed the door, hung his coat. The lantern between them wavered with shadows. She passed him a loaf of bread, her hands steady. He took it, their eyes meeting for the briefest second. This time she didn't look away. Neither did he. Something in his chest cracked, not loudly, but like ice breaking under spring thaw. The next morning, silence hung different again. Not brittle, not cold, just waiting. Caleb fixed a fence post, brewed coffee in the tin kettle, then cleared his throat. "About the letter," he said. Lila looked up from folding towels. "He didn't sit. I didn't send it. Mason did. Thought he was helping." She nodded as if confirming what she already knew. "I figured. You did. You flinched the first time I touched your arm," she said evenly. "Men who want wives don't do that." Caleb felt heat crawl up his neck. "I didn't ask you to come here. You can leave. You're not beholden." Lila set the folded towel on the table, then walked over. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled slightly. "I didn't come here for a husband, Mr. Rourke. I came for a chance. Not just to survive, but to live. To matter to someone, to myself." Her words came like truth scraped raw. "I've scrubbed floors for drunkards, cooked for strangers, hid from hands that never asked permission. That's surviving. Here, I cook for one man who never touches me, who boils water when I cough, who leaves an extra coat on the peg when sleet rolls in. That's living, at least more than what I left." Caleb stared at her, not at the words, but the weight behind them. "I want to stay," Lila said simply, "if you'll let me earn my keep." Something deep in Caleb gave way, slow as dry earth cracking under spring rain. He swallowed, then stay, with wages, with choice, always your choice. From that day forward, the rhythm of the ranch shifted. Lila moved not like a stranger filling empty space, but like someone claiming her own. She swept patched, mucked stalls. Caleb built her a storage shelf, replaced a cracked window pane above her bed. Evenings they ate together, sometimes talking, sometimes just listening to the fire gnaw at the logs while the wind shook the shutters. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something rarer in a land where survival left little room for grace, the beginning of trust. Spring rains turned Millwater's streets into sticky rivers of mud. Caleb Rourke rode in anyway, hat pulled low, coat drawn tight. He needed flour salt and Hinge's simple things. But in town, nothing stayed simple long. The general store was crowded that day. Caleb moved like always, shoulders set, voice low. He laid out his supplies, coins stacked neat. That's when the saloon doors across the street slammed open and Harlan McGivens stumbled into daylight. A drunk with a mean streak, he swaggered toward Caleb as though the whole street were his stage. "Well, look here," Harlan jeered, voice loud enough to hook every ear. "Cain's ghost finally crawled out of hiding. And I hear he's got himself a housemaid, sweet little thing, came in on the coach. What she cost you, Rourke, a lie in a bed?" The crowd tittered, nervous laughter riding the edge of cruelty. Caleb didn't flinch, didn't even raise his head. He gathered his parcels. Harlan pressed closer, spitting venom with every step. She earning her keep, or just lying back, praying you ain't too rusty. The world went still. Caleb's jaw tightened, eyes narrowing under the brim. Then, without warning, he stepped forward and drove his fist clean into Harlan's jaw. One hit, sharp, final. Harlan went down into the mud with a grunt, clutching his face. Caleb stood over him, not gloating, not raising his voice, just steady. "She's worth 10 of any man in this town," he said, "and she's staying." The street hushed. No one answered, only the rain pattering steady on rooftops. Caleb turned, loaded his supplies into his saddlebag, and rode out. Behind him, whispers shifted from mockery to wary respect. That night back at the ranch, the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside Caleb's chest. Lila Hart sat by the hearth, mending with steady hands. The shirt she worked on was his, torn at the shoulder seam. She didn't look up until he stood in the doorway, mud still on his boots, hat in hand. "It tore here," she said softly, showing the stitch. "Thought you'd want it mended before the cold turned sharper." Caleb lingered at the threshold, remembering Mason's confession, Harlan's insult, the way the whole town watched. He felt a weight he couldn't name, pressing harder than any chore. Lila lowered her gaze back to the fabric. Her voice thinned, but it didn't tremble. "I didn't ask to be here, but since I am, I might as well be useful." He closed the door, hung his coat, and sat. She handed him a loaf of bread, hands calm. For the first time when their eyes met, neither looked away. Under that quiet, something hard inside him cracked. Days stretched into weeks. Their lives settled into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like living. Lila claimed the cabin as her own, not by asking permission, but by acting like she belonged. She cooked, patched, fed the hens. Caleb built her a storage shelf, replaced a cracked window pane, small offerings that said more than words he couldn't find. One evening, rain hammered the roof as thunder rolled down the valley. Lila had fallen asleep at the table, head resting on her arms. Candlelight softened her face, hair loose around her shoulders. Caleb's book, unopened in his hand, rose quietly. He fetched the wool blanket from the settee and draped it over her shoulders. For a moment, his hand moved on its own, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. Her skin was warm, alive. He didn't flinch this time. For 15 years, he hadn't let himself touch another soul. Now he did not out of duty, but out of something stirring deeper. A week later, while searching the attic for nails, Lila found a box wrapped in linen. Inside lay a framed photograph. She unwrapped it slowly, breath-catching. A younger Caleb, smiling wide arm, wrapped around a woman who looked strong, beautiful, certain of her place at his side. His wife. That evening, she came down to the porch photograph, cradled in her hands. Sunset painted everything gold. Caleb sat polishing his boots. When she placed the picture between them, his hand stilled. "I wasn't snooping," she said quickly. "I was looking for nails." He nodded, throat tight. "She was beautiful," Lila whispered. His jaw clenched. "I thought you might be angry." "I'm not." She pushed the frame back toward him. "I'm not her. I never will be. But I can love you. In the way I know how." Caleb's eyes burned. His voice cracked low and hoarse. "I thought if I kept quiet, if I never touched, I'd never lose again." Lila didn't argue. She simply laid her hand near his on the bench, not touching, but close enough to be chosen. Caleb looked at it, then at her, and for the first time in 15 years, the dam inside him broke. Not with sobs or words, but with a slow, silent crumpling shoulders, shaking, tears running down a weathered face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For what? For being alive when she isn't." Lila blinked back her own tears. "You don't need to apologize. You lived. That's not betrayal. That's a miracle." A broken laugh escaped him, half relief, half disbelief. "Didn't know I needed to hear that." She smiled through trembling lips. "We all need reminding sometimes that we're allowed to keep going." Caleb set the photograph aside gently, like laying down a burden. He turned to her, eyes raw, and saw not the shadow of a woman he lost, but the one who had arrived by mistake and stayed by choice. By the time April stretched long over the valley, the land itself seemed to shift. The last snow melted from the ridges, streams ran fuller, and the earth smelled of thawed clay and green beginnings. Caleb Rourke woke each morning to the sound of hens clucking the kettle, hissing, and the quiet presence of Lila Hart moving through the cabin as though she had always belonged. They didn't speak of what they were. They didn't need to. What had begun as silence edged with distance became silence edged with comfort. Caleb built shelves and fixed hinges without being asked. Lila baked bread and tucked biscuits into his saddlebag when he rode fence lines. Their words were few, but their gestures said everything. The way he left tools within her, reached the way she folded his shirts with seams, straightened the way their eyes lingered across the fire. One morning she placed cinnamon on his list, "Only if it isn't too dear," she said, almost like an afterthought. He rode to town through mud and sideways rain to fetch it. When a drunk mocked her name, Caleb put the man in the dirt with a single punch and told the watching crowd, "She's worth 10 of any man in this town." By the time he returned, saddlebag heavy with flour salt and that jar of cinnamon, Lila was waiting at the porch. She didn't ask what had happened. She only met his eyes, nodded once, and set the jar on the shelf as though it had always been meant for them. Nights grew warmer. Some evenings she fell asleep at the table, hair loose around her shoulders. Caleb would rise quietly, drape a blanket over her brush, a strand of hair from her cheek, and feel that old wall inside him crumble a little further. Each act of care was small, but together they built something solid. Not a sudden blaze, but a steady fire. Summer crept closer. The hens laid regular. Again, calves kicked up dust in the pasture, and the rhythm of their partnership became the rhythm of home. Then one morning, as Lila stood by the window, pouring water into a canteen, Caleb noticed her apron stretched differently at the front. Just a gentle curve barely visible, but enough that the buttons no longer met. Her hand rested there absently, like her body already knew what her mind hadn't yet spoken aloud. He didn't ask. He only noticed the quiet way she caught him watching, and the look in her eyes that said yes. Life shifted again, slower but deeper. Caleb worked the fence lines, mending where winter had split posts, while Lila brought him water and biscuits, her figure fuller, steadier. Sometimes she stood beside him while he hammered boards, their hands brushing when he passed her a tool. For a man who thought he'd die alone, each touch felt like a miracle he didn't deserve, but one he accepted anyway. One evening, after a long day under the hot sun, he set down his hammer, turned to her, and without speeches simply took her hand. His calloused fingers wrapped around hers, grounding sure. "I thought I'd live and die alone," he admitted, voice low. "But you were the mistake I needed." Lila's throat tightened. She leaned against his chest, her rounded belly fitting perfectly between them. He held her carefully as though holding both her and the future. For the first time in 15 years, he didn't feel cursed. He felt chosen. Later that summer, they saddled their horses at golden hour, the air smelling of rain and earth. Caleb adjusted her stirrups, raising one brow. "You sure you're up for a ride?" "I'm pregnant, not broken," she teased, swinging into the saddle with ease. He chuckled, shaking his head. Together they rode into the open valley, side by side. The wind tugged at her hair, the sky spread wide in apricot hues, and she laughed freely, a sound Caleb realized he hadn't heard enough in his life. They didn't need words. Their hands brushed on the reins, a wordless promise made between them, not about perfection, not about forever, but about choice. That they would choose each other again and again, even when it was hard, especially then. As the sun dipped behind the ridges, Caleb looked at her and saw not a shadow of the past, but the woman who had arrived by mistake and stayed by her own decision. Lila looked back and saw not a haunted man, but one who had fought his way back to being human. In that valley, with dusk painting the sky, they found something neither had expected, the right mistake that became the truest choice of all. If this story stirred something in you, if you felt every silence, every hesitant touch, every hard-won moment of trust, remember this: love isn't always grand gestures. Sometimes it's the quiet courage of showing up again and again, even when it hurts. Sometimes it's choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. Caleb and Lila's story reminds us that the past doesn't have to define the future, and even mistakes can turn into miracles if we let them. What about you? Do you believe second chances can grow into something lasting? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. And if you want more stories of raw, real frontier hearts, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell. There's always another tale waiting. Another reminder that sometimes the wrong path leads us exactly where we belong.